What if I told you I knew who was going to win the next Grand Slam on the women's tour? You probably wouldn't believe me. But even if you did, I'd only be setting myself up for yet another prediction disaster. But why is this so? Why do so many women defy the odds, and why has it become so hard to know for sure who's going to win any given match, let alone a tournament on the WTA Tour? The WTA has become a lot more exciting for most fans, but definitely not for sports bettors, because I can't imagine how much money goes down the drain after yet another wrong prediction. And, well, they're not exactly alone. I had Iga making a deep run at Wimbledon this year, and I was so sure she was going to win the Olympic gold medal on clay, but guess what? I was wrong both times. So I went back to the drawing board to see if I really sucked at making predictions on the WTA Tour, or if there was more to it. Today I found my answer. With new players rising to the top of the game every week, and top 10 players not automatically making deep runs at slams and other major tournaments, you just never know who's going to win the next title. It's both a blessing and a curse. Maybe more of a blessing. But let me take you on a trip down memory lane to explain the current parity on the WTA Tour. Back in the 70s, women's tennis had few dominant names. But Chris Evert was dominating with the best counterpunching skills out there, and she was one of the pioneer baseliners, and also one of the first women to popularize the two-handed backhand. She also had the consistency and fitness to back her style of play. Evert controlled the tour in her day, and even won 18 Grand Slams in singles. But then we had Martina Navratilova right behind her. From the late 70s up until the late 80s, Navratilova's serve and volley game was almost impossible to beat, and you only needed to look at some of her records to see just how crazy they were. 167 singles titles and 177 doubles titles? Man, that's a joke. But yeah, she was that good. In the 1982 and 1983 seasons, she went 90-3 and 86-1 respectively. No, those aren't typos. We also remember her for being one of the first female players to prioritize diet and exercise. We then had Steffi Graf showing up from the late 80s to the mid-90s with one of the most complete games out there, and also a destructive inside-out forehand, and a powerful serve that could blast anyone off the court. And the best part? Unlike Navratilova, who won more on the faster courts, and Evert on the slower courts, Graf won more titles across the board, bagged the calendar year Grand Slam, and 22 Grand Slams over her illustrious career. Monica Seles then challenged Graf for the biggest titles in the early 90s with her power-based and highly aggressive playstyle. Seles had this really weird double-handed forehand and backhand that both came off the racket really flat, but with insane speed, power, and depth. Stay with me, I'm going somewhere with this. Fast forward to the late 90s and early 2000s. The Williams sisters had now taken over, adding yet another layer of physicality to the game. Serena Williams had the best serve in all of women's tennis. She also had effective kick and slice serves to back up her first serve when she was missing. We all know what Serena achieved. I mean, she's arguably the GOAT. To a much lesser extent than Serena, though, we also saw periods of dominance from players like Martina Hingis, Justine Henin, Sharapova, Kim Clijsters, Angelique Kerber, Naomi Osaka, and Ash Barty, to name a few. The point being, from the beginning of the Open era up until the late 2010s, the WTA Tour was ruled by a select few. Some of them were generational talents, while others simply had a style of play that opponents didn't have an answer to. But for most of the last decade, it's been a different story altogether. The WTA has become so unpredictable, with new faces seemingly coming out of nowhere nearly every week. 10 different players have been ranked world number 1 in the last 7 to 8 seasons. Last season, 4 different women were Grand Slam champions, with 3 of them being first-time champions. We've now had 8 different champions in the last 8 editions of Wimbledon, and 2 of those last 3 champs were unseeded. Iga Swiatek is the only player to win multiple slams in a year since Serena Williams in 2015. There have been 18 first-time champions in the past 35 Grand Slams. And don't even get me started on the finalists. If we add WTA 1000 and 500 tournaments to the mix, where we also see a lot of top seeds get upset, it's just going to be crazy. Now let's compare the situation of things on the WTA from 1999 to 2019, and then see how it stacks up to the ATP Tour. We see the number of first-time champions and finalists have almost doubled in the last 4 seasons alone. But on the men's tour, it hasn't quite been the same. So what exactly has changed? Well, since I couldn't find all the answers myself, I reached out to a few of my friends from the WTA Tour. I figured they'd know better, so you'll be hearing from them throughout the video. The game has evolved over the last couple of decades and has become more physical than ever. Players now have more resources at their disposal to maximize their physical potential and compete more at the highest level. So with most players maxing out their physicality, the playing field has become more even in that regard. Also, the increased physicality and congested schedule leads to more injuries and time off, which essentially means that we might not get to see those sustained levels of dominance at the top like before. I reached out to Czech-American pro tennis player and Drop Shot series host Gabriela Knudsen for more insights on some of the reasons behind the parity on the WTA Tour. Here's what she says about the increased intensity and physicality that's become a key part of the women's game.
I do think training is getting much better, and I do think there's a lot of sponsorships. Some people find also rich families. For example, Pegula and Navarro come from very wealthy families, which is great for their tennis because they have that initial capital that can then get them going and it snowballs. Also, on the other side, yes, I think a lot of people are getting very physical, but then a lot of people are getting injured. For example, Czech tennis is unreal, right? But now most of our girls are injured, which I believe the men might be a little bit more resilient to injury. Just because they're men, they're probably able to withstand this schedule day in and day out, week in and week out.
We could also point to more variety as one of the reasons for parity. This is an interesting point because back in the day, we also saw a lot of variety from the ladies. Justine Henin, for example, had some of the best technique, while Martina Hingis' problem solving and understanding of the game was god tier. The Williams sisters had the big game, and Kleisters had great defensive abilities, just to name a few examples. But despite what you might think, that hasn't changed much today. I know we have a truckload of baseliners, but we also have players like Emma Navarro and Coco Gauff who rely on their athleticism. Ons Jabeur has one of the best drop shots, Ostapenko and Sabalenka bring the power, Rybakina has the big serve, and all that. But the biggest difference these days is the depth in the field. But don't just take my word for it. You see, I also spoke to someone who's actually beaten many of the top WTA players from the last 10 years, and she was kind enough to answer my questions. Christina Mikhail is a former top 25 player. During her playing days, she had big wins over top women and Grand Slam champs like Victoria Azarenka, Caroline Wozniacki twice, Petra Kvitova, and Garbina Muguruza. Here's what Christina says about the competition and physicality these days. How would you describe the current level of competition in women's tennis right now?
Yeah, I think the level is so high. I think you're seeing obviously like how physical the game has become. And like, I think just with more resources that players have now in terms of like traveling with fitness trainers, traveling with, maybe mental coaches or traveling with physios and things like that. I think it's just kind of like pushed the level and just allowed the competition to just keep growing and the game to get a lot more physical. And so I think that's why you're seeing just like there's no easy matches, basically.
She also points out that longevity is another contributing factor that adds another layer of depth to the field. There are an increasing number of players that peak later in their careers after having relatively little success in their younger years, like Jessica Pegula, Jasmine Paolini, Katie Boulter, and Danielle Collins. And then there are the ones who take time off due to pregnancy or mental stress and just come back stronger. So just like from your perspective, what is it about the women's game where it seems like really anybody in the top 150 really can beat anybody in the top 10 on their day?
Obviously, I think with just prize money continuing to go up and things like that, I think it's just allowing more players access to have the right team surrounding them. And I think in doing so, it's just kind of raising the level. And so I think that's a big factor. And I think just also players are playing longer. They can have a family, come back and still play. So I think the longevity of the women players right now and just access to more resources is helping that.
But hold up, we're not done just yet. This season, we saw how Sinner beating Djokovic gave the next gen more belief that they could get their own wins against Novak. Now this is just something that happens on an even bigger scale on the WTA Tour. Here's how Christina puts it.
I think also players are getting inspired by other players, seeing them kind of like have this amazing week, and then it kind of is like this trickle effect of like, okay, if that player can do it, like why can't I do it? And like it's, I don't know, as a fan now watching, I'm like just super inspired by like all the stories that you constantly see on the women's side, and it's just really cool to watch it happen.
As a player, imagine someone ranked lower than you making a major final. It only gives you that extra push of motivation to do the same. Now, a lot of WTA players have adopted this mindset, well, if she can do it, then so can I. But then I asked myself, why isn't this the case on the ATP Tour? Luckily, there I have an answer.
Depth is created when more people and more players believe that they can win. I'm going to take you back to 1954. Remember when Bannister broke the 4-minute mile that they thought couldn't happen? Suddenly after that, so many people are breaking it. It's more a belief. Serena has retired. And I looked at the stat the other day. More players now are feeling also that they could become top players. There are 28 players this year on the WTA Tour that won tournaments this year that did not win a tournament last year. So it becomes down to belief, and when they see their friends winning, they think they can win. And depth that's what creates depth in the game. More and more people think they can win.
So how has the emergence of younger players impacted the overall competitiveness of the WTA Tour?
I think young players are hungry. Sometimes you could also say that young players are not, what happens when you get older, you get a little bit more nervous. That's the first thing that goes, is you're getting nervous about the game. But the young people, they are just so naive in a good way, where they just go and they compete. And then on top of that, their peers that they've been growing up with now sees that they're winning. And then that belief escalate among all these younger generations that I can do that. I've played against this player. We're the same age. And then that becomes a competition within itself. And some of them are now beating the top players. So that helps the situation.
One of the biggest reasons we see more parity in the women's game, especially in the majors, is because of the best-of-3 format, which leads to more upsets on the women's tour. The longer the match, the better the test of a player's mental and physical endurance. WTA players play best-of-3 all year round, including in the majors. The men play best-of-3 most of the year, except in the majors where they play best-of-5. Now this is significant because the best-of-5 format is much more forgiving when it comes to slow starts. For example, at this year's Wimbledon, the men's singles tournament featured 35 5-set matches. If the men played best-of-3 instead, here are some of the upsets we could have seen. Bellucci defeating Shelton 6-4, 3-6, 6-3. Shang defeating Dimitrov 7-5, 7-6. Tiafoe defeating Alcaraz as the number 3 seed 7-5, 2-6, 6-4, and Virtanen defeating number 12 seed Tommy Paul 6-4, 3-6, 7-5. All 4 of those upsets would have been huge and would have definitely changed the final outcome of the tournament. On the flip side, maybe we could have seen things turn out differently for some players if it was best-of-5 on the women's tour. Would Iga have regrouped to beat Putintseva in 5? Could Jasmine Paolini physically wear down Krejcikova in a 4th and 5th set? Would Lulu Sun have made as deep of a run, especially coming from the qualies? Well, we'll never know for sure, but it is interesting to think about. Now, I'm not suggesting we change anything, I'm just pointing out that best-of-3 allows for more upsets than best-of-5. And this is something that Christina agrees with too.
Maybe I think in the slams, when you're playing, men play 3 out of 5 sets, like in that longer span, like it's harder to have more upsets. Whereas on the women's side, 2 out of 3 sets, like you can see more upsets because there's less time to work with, and you can win a set and get up early in the second, and like all of a sudden, there's not much more left in the match.
Still, it's not all there is, because why aren't we seeing the same number of upsets on the men's side when they play best-of-3? There must be something else to it. We all know this is tennis, and it's not only physical, but also mental. At the moment, Iga, Sabalenka, Goff, and Rybakina are the dominant players on the tour. But it isn't just because of their physical game, they have the mental strength and mindset to back it up.
Mentally, you have to be ready for competition. And it's not easy, it's a process, it takes time, but consistently working on the mind will add for you to compete in a higher level and more consistent.
I won 1 WTA title and I was dead tired after that, like mentally more, I think, than physically. And like to be able to kind of just like week in and week out, like just have that level of expectation for yourself, bring that level. And I think their mindset really kind of makes the difference between being able to like maintain and stay there versus kind of having a a week where you do really well.
But at the same time, the current top 3 or top 4 don't dominate all the Grand Slams or the entire season. Iga dominates on clay, but is clearly beatable on other surfaces. The others, they aren't strong enough to dominate on any surface for a long time. Rybakina has been dealing with a lot of health issues, and Coco Gauff's forehand continues to break down at crucial moments. But despite these players being at the top, there have been question marks around their mental resilience. Gabriela pointed out the fact that men in general seem to know how to handle clutch moments better. Here's what she says.
Like literally in my match 2 days ago, I lost 11 games in a row. How that is possible, I don't know, but it just got worse and worse and worse, and I didn't know how to pick myself out of that rut. No matter what I did, I just could not. And I think men would be better at picking up themselves out of that, I think. Also because emotionally they can be more calm and maybe look at it from a different perspective, even though like I have been improving. That's why I got higher and higher in the rankings. Like my mental side has improved a lot, but I think there's a ceiling in the women's tennis.
And the mental aspect has a trickle-down effect on emotional stability on the tour. That's not to say the men don't face these same health and mental issues as well. Just for whatever reason, these challenges are more pronounced or more publicized in the women's game. Why do you think this is? Be sure to let me know in the comments. We all know life gets in the way of tennis many times, and women seem to be a little bit more affected than men. A woman at the top of the ranking might decide she wants to get pregnant and start a family like Serena and a few others. Others might see their priorities change like Ash Barty and Garbiñe Muguruza. A few others might suffer from depression like Naomi Osaka. Someone like Danielle Collins, who's a current top 10 player, has literally decided to retire at the end of the season. So clearly, we do see these patterns emerge every once in a while. Gabriela believes that psychosocial problems or some other major life events may sometimes get in the way for WTA players, and have some effects on how they turn up on the court more commonly than you would typically see on the men's tour.
We are more emotional and we will take it more personal and we'll just think about it a bit harder and deeper. And that's just how we are physically. Literally, biology and our brain compositions are more structured toward being more emotional. So I think that affects us more on the court than it would a man. I think a man can kind of turn that off and be very pragmatic and systematic with his tennis and kind of let that stuff go. We cannot as much.
That's an interesting point. What do you think about that? Or maybe one could argue there's just a lack of generational talent on the current WTA tour. Gabriela broke down what the level of competition looked like within the top 50 and top 100.
I don't think the differences are that big. I would say there's a cutoff in the top 100, well, top 50, and then top 100 and top 200. I think the margins between the top 115 and 190 aren't that thin, but from 119 to 49, huge difference just from the trainings that I've done and the girls I've played.
According to Gabriela, the differences aren't that pronounced within the top 50, and that could explain why it's easy to see an unseeded player win a tournament. But I was wondering, could this also be due to a lack of generational talent? You see, when Roger Federer entered his prime, you could clearly see that he was a cut above the rest. On the women's side, it was the same case with Serena, Graf, and Martina Navratilova too. These players were among the pioneers of their respective eras when it came to physical training, diet, and of course, relentless practice on court. This is where I believe they made their mark, establishing themselves as the game's elite. But is it possible that the playing field has become more even because of the lack of generational talent? Or is this because of a much more condensed field when it comes to the combination of ability and training? To bring it back to the present, it's clear that even though Iga is so dominant at the moment, we can't really put her in the same category as Serena Williams, at least for now. I also had an afterthought that one of the reasons for the parity could be due to stylistic differences between both tours. The WTA is more of a return-dominated tour, unlike the ATP, which is a serve-dominated tour. One of the reasons Serena dominated everyone so bad was primarily due to her serve, which was at the time the best in the women's game. It's just not the same these days. Even the best servers on tour regularly catch the yips on their serves. To make the point more clearly, take a look at the hold percentage on the ATP tour among the top players. The average hold percentage here is 83.4%. Now let's compare that with the women's tour. The average hold percentage, only 70%. See the difference now? If you said the women don't serve as well as the men, you wouldn't be wrong. The men have bigger serves, hit them with more disguise and variety, and are able to generate depth and topspin on a fairly consistent basis, all the way down through the rankings, even going into junior tennis. Now, a lot of this is just biology. Most female players just don't have the muscular development to get the same power and spin compared to the men. On the flip side, this does place a greater emphasis on the return in the women's game, which leads to longer rallies and more opportunities to create offense against the serve. On the women's side, the second serves are also considerably weaker. On the WTA, only Iga and Rybakina have held 80% of the time. On the men's side, there are almost 40 players who have held serve at least 80% of the time in the last 52 weeks. As a result of the lower hold percentages, women generally have better chances on the return compared to the men. Here, have a look. Not being able to win so many free points off the serve is yet another reason for the parity in women's tennis. All of these things add up, and in the end, we just haven't gotten to see the same types of rivalries like we did before. I mean, look at the head-to-head between Iga and Coco, and then the head-to-head between Coco and Sabalenka, and then Rybakina and Iga. What about Iga and Sabalenka? In some of those matches, the scores aren't as close as you would expect from two top 3 players going up against each other. So to recap, here's what I think about the parity and unpredictability on the women's tour. First of all, there should be no debate about women playing best of 5. Even the women themselves aren't down for that.
I do think that we don't have as much time to show the overall level because it's 3 sets instead of 5. But then the argument that women should play 5 is, I don't think that's a good one at all, because no one wants to watch women play 5 sets. The level in the final will be atrocious, and that's just a fact. We physically cannot handle playing 5 sets, so I don't think women should be playing 5 sets whatsoever. 3 sets maximum, because also the tournament is so long. I've talked to male players and asked them how they play the 5-set matches and if they play it differently, and they said that the tactics are a lot different. That, for example, if you get broken at 3-3, you kind of give away the match. I don't know, if you see across the tournament of a Grand Slam, you can kind of see that there's a lot of 6-3, 6-2 sets. And that's because if you get broken on your serve once, you kind of give the set away and you're like, that's okay because I have 4 more to go.
Secondly, we really shouldn't be comparing the WTA to the ATP Tour because they're at different stages of growth. The men's game went through a similar period in the early 2000s when Sampras and Agassi were retiring. Many players battled it out for the biggest prizes. Rafter, Moya, Safan, Hewitt, Kurtan, and Roddick all before Federer arrived. The point being, what we saw from the big 3 isn't normal. And that shouldn't make us think that the WTA sucks for not having such dominant players. Also, I should add that it's going to take someone like Iga several years to live up to the legacy of Serena Williams. The third takeaway for me would be that we shouldn't exactly say there's a lack of consistency on the WTA Tour because of its unpredictability. The lack of a dominant force like Serena or the ATP's Big 3 doesn't mean the tour is less competitive. In fact, I'd even say the opposite. I'd rather view the depth in the women's field as a strength rather than a weakness, seeing that the pool of talent is spread out rather than concentrated at the top. The truth is, we need consistency on multiple levels, not just at the top, and that's literally what's happening in real time. The second tier or middle class group of players has developed to become a consistent threat to the ones at the top. I think that the WTA now has a perfect mix of top players excelling at the biggest events and a super strong chasing pack that's constantly challenging them. I also think that the WTA as a product will keep getting stronger, and soon enough, its unpredictability will be celebrated instead of criticized. We have so many beautiful stories popping up, and at the end of the day, any woman inside the top 50 with the right form and fitness has a very good chance at winning a major title. Maybe this is how it should have been all along. We need the parity on the WTA Tour, and maybe the men's tour would benefit from the same thing. At the end of the day, when you take a look in the mirror and ask yourself, do I really want the same 1 or 2 players winning every single event? I believe you know the answer. There's so much to be excited about on the women's tour, and the parity plays a huge role in that. But let me know your thoughts in the comments section because there's plenty to talk about. Special thanks to Christina McHale and Gabriella Knutson for taking the time out of their busy schedules to share their thoughts and experiences with me. And if you guys want to see more content like this where we include pro tennis players and other influential people in the sport, be sure to let me know. I had a blast putting this one together. Until next time, keep going for the lines.